I apologize for getting this new podcast in 2024 out a little bit late. And that's because I am now podcasting from home, and there are a little few twists and turns, and I've had to learn about. But anyway, we'll try to do it and see what happens. This week we are going to do a podcast with a very, very familiar Old Testament character, namely Joseph. Joseph is something of a favorite character for people who love biblical stories. Of course, he did become famous by saving his whole family from possible destruction because of a horrendous famine. Still, though he ended up on top, so to speak, he began in a pit, waiting to see what his angry brothers had in store for him. That makes him something of a sympathetic character. At the same time, there were reasons that he was treated so harshly. These reasons become evident and even quite understandable when we take a look at how the story begins. The drama featuring the beginning of this famous biblical character is narrated in the book of Genesis, chapter 37. As the story starts, it is told in almost a prosaic fashion. We learn that Jacob was living in the land where his father had sojourned. In this instance, the word father probably does double duty in that it refers both to Jacob's literal father, Isaac, and to his grandfather, the famous Abraham. The land, of course, was Canaan, a land that God had promised to Jacob and, of course, his father and grandfather. That's in verse 1 of chapter 37. Indeed, even though we think of this as the beginning of the Joseph story, the narrator lets us know that this is part of the story of Jacob's family. So far, Joseph is not yet singled out as a main figure. But that immediately changes. Even though Joseph was one of Jacob's youngest sons, only one brother was younger, he seems to get special attention by being introduced first. Indeed, we learn that he was engaged in the family business of taking care of sheep. Though Joseph is named, his brothers are not. In fact, they are identified only by their mothers, in this case, Bilhah and Zilpah. Strangely, neither Leah nor Rachel is mentioned at this point. Does this mean that the brothers being referred to are limited to Dan and Naphtali, who were born to Bilhah, and Gad and Asher, who were born to Zilpah? Those stories are found in Genesis 30, verses 1 through 13. Perhaps, though clearly in the remainder of the stories, all of Joseph's brothers apparently are in view. A couple of details accompanying mentioning Joseph's name, namely that he was 17 years old and, more importantly, that he told his father about his brother's evil report, or perhaps you have to translate it as a report about them. What does this mean? Was Joseph telling his father that his sons were doing poorly with the sheep business? Was he saying that they were skimming off profits for themselves? Or is this a more generalized report about something terribly immoral about the way they were conducting their lives? No specifics are supplied. All we have is this cryptic statement that Joseph brought their evil report, or an evil report about them, to his father. Whatever we make of this, Joseph's doing this was surely not going to endear him to his older siblings. That's in verse 2 of chapter 37. Family dynamics were hardly improved by Jacob's paternal behavior. He happened to love Joseph more than any other of his other children. One assumes that this includes Dinah, his daughter, though the Hebrew has merely sons indicated in the text. The reason for this special affection was that Jacob was an older man when Joseph was born. The fact that Rachel might have been the easy reason behind Jacob's favoring Joseph may be inferred, but it is not explicit in the text. Jacob expressed his partiality by making Joseph a long robe with sleeves. That's in verse 3. Naturally, his brothers noticed their father's partiality, but they took out their anger not on him, but on the brother who benefited from Jacob's largesse. That's in verse 4. The upshot of this was that Joseph's brothers grew to hate him, and thus found it impossible even to speak with him in a civil manner. This precarious family situation was worsened when Joseph had a couple of dreams, the contents of which he shared with his brothers. This threw gas onto the fire. His brothers intensified their hatred. That's in verse 5. The content of the dreams makes us understand their reaction immediately. Their negative response is precisely what one would have expected. Joseph's two dreams do not require a Freudian psychologist to interpret. To the contrary, their meaning is quite obvious. Very often, dreams in the Old Testament are means of divine revelation. In this case, though, no mention of Joseph's dreams as indicative of the divine will is noted. For now, at least, they are merely Joseph's personal dreams. In Joseph's first dream, he and his brothers were binding sheaves in a cornfield. That was a common agricultural activity. As the sheaves were being gathered, however, Joseph's sheaf somehow arose and stood upright, as strange as that sounds. Then, remarkably, the sheaves that had been gathered by Joseph's siblings surround Joseph's single sheaf and bow down to it. The brothers immediately sensed the implication of this image, which prompted them to ask incredulously whether Joseph had the temerity to think that he would one day rule over them and thereby have dominion over them. That's in verses 5 through 8 of chapter 37. It is hardly surprising that this outrageous dream fueled the siblings' hatred of their younger brother. Both Joseph's words and his dream had infuriated his brothers. Were that not bad enough, Joseph had a second dream, which he eagerly shared once again with his already outraged siblings. He was jumping from the pot into the fire. The second dream featured the celestial realm. This time around, Joseph was represented by an astral orb which elicited obsequious heavenly bodies, including the sun, the moon, and 11 stars, bowing to this orb. The 11 brothers are clearly referring to the rest of Joseph's brothers. This second dream even gave Jacob, Joseph's father, pause. Jacob interpreted the dream as meaning that he was the sun, whereas Rachel, Joseph's mother, was the moon. This meant that his whole family was bowing before Joseph in what the family saw as a delusion of grandeur. That was the extent of Jacob's rebuke, however. He thought about this some, but said nothing further about it. At the same time, this second dream only inflamed the anger of his 11 brothers. To their anger, they now added jealousy. That's in verses 9 through 11 of chapter 37. From their point of view, Joseph's sense of future entitlement was too much to bear. In their eyes, he was nothing more than a spoiled brat. These dreams caused a bad family dynamic to become virtually beyond repair. It did not help that Jacob was tone deaf to these dynamics. Right after Joseph's dreams, his brothers left town to seek pasture for the sheep. Instead of being grateful for a little time for hurt feelings to subside and anger to dissipate, Jacob made the whole situation worse by deciding to send Joseph to his brothers. Of course, the very fact that the brothers were taking care of the family business while Joseph got to stay home only underscores Jacob's ill-advised favoritism. Jacob, this time called by his new name Israel, decided to ask Joseph to go to his brothers, find out how they were doing, inquire about the sheep, and bring back the news. The fact that Jacob, now named Israel, reminded Joseph to inquire how the flock was doing as well reminds us that Joseph did not have anything good to say in the initial report. That report triggered his siblings' ire. What happened next was completely predictable. Joseph agreed to do his father's bidding. That's in verses 12 to 13. Jacob had already told Joseph that his brothers were at Shechem with the sheep. So Joseph, of course, headed for Shechem. When he got there, though, neither his brothers nor the sheep were there. As he was wandering around a field looking aimlessly about, a man approached him and asked him what he was looking for. That's in verse 15. Parenthetically, in episode 12 of this podcast series, I featured a sermon I preached on this text, the very one when the man asked Joseph, "What are you looking for?" You can go find that podcast on my website, faspina.com. In any case, Joseph replied that he was looking for his brothers and their flocks, which he thought were in Shechem. It just so happened that the man had overheard the brothers when they decided to move the flocks to Dothan, obviously to find fresh grass. Once he heard that, Joseph took off for Dothan. The way this drama is unfolding, we anticipate conflict, perhaps great conflict, when Joseph does get to Dothan, where his hating brothers had gone. We will deal with the conclusion of that story in the next podcast. For now, there's a couple of things I need to tell you. By the end of January, I'm hoping to have set up the ability for you to sign up to take mini courses. I will offer one per month, and we're trying to get this set up. It's a little bit more complicated and more than I am able to do myself, so I'm getting some help. But watch for those announcements. In the meantime, go to my website. Let me know what your email is so that I'll have a way to communicate with you. If you have a question to ask about that you would like me to address, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. Let me make you aware that I would never share your email with anyone. I would only use this to find out what your question is, and I will not even necessarily mention your name when I answer the questions. So for now, goodbye.